In the soft glow of candlelight, let us drift back to a world where shadows were long and justice was swift. In the 1600s, the figure of the executioner loomed large in every village and town square. He was a man both needed and despised, a figure wrapped in mystery, standing at the edge of life and death. His hands held the tools of judgment, his heart carried burdens few could imagine. But what was life like for him when the crowd dispersed, the axe was cleaned, and the scaffold stood empty? This story explores the quiet, often overlooked moments of an executioner's life. It is not about the thrill of violence or the drama of the gallows. Instead, it invites you to step softly into his world, where each day began with fear and ended with uneasy sleep. You will learn about the rituals of his trade, the careful preparation of his tools, and the complex emotions that weighed on his mind. We will sit with him by the hearth as he removes his hood, listen to his thoughts as he sharpens his blade, and feel the tension in his hands as he lies awake at night. This is not a story of cruelty, it is a story of humanity in an age when justice was public and death was a spectacle. Each word is spoken in a slow, gentle tone designed to lull you toward peace, even as you imagine this strange and heavy life. So settle into your bed, close your eyes, and let us wander through the quiet corridors of history. The executioner's tale awaits. In the quiet streets of a small 17th century town, long before the rising of the sun, a man would stir in his bed. He was no ordinary villager by trade. He was an executioner by reputation. He was both feared and needed. His neighbors avoided his gaze in daylight, but when the town square filled for a hanging or a beheading, all eyes turned toward him. But who were these men, the executioners of the 1600s? Were they born into their roles, or did they choose them? As we drift back into this shadowy time, let us look closely, softly, at the life and identity of a man whose job stood between law and death. Most executioners were not born to the role. They were often chosen, or perhaps forced into it by circumstance. In some cases, criminals who had themselves been sentenced to death were offered a choice, the gallows or the axe. If they chose the axe, they lived, but became forever marked as an executioner. Others inherited the position in certain families. The role passed from father to son, each generation carrying the burden forward. The job paid well compared to farming or crafts, but it came with a cost: isolation. The role required precision, strength, and an iron will. To wield an axe or tie a noose demanded not only skill, but a strange kind of detachment. The townspeople relied on the executioner to deliver justice swiftly, yet the same people often avoided, shaking his hand as though death itself clung to his skin. When we picture an executioner, we often imagine a man in a black hood, his face hidden. In truth, not every executioner wore such a hood, but some did, and for reasons both practical and symbolic. The hood served as a shield, protecting his identity from the angry families of those he executed. It was also a mask of anonymity in a role that carried so much stigma. When a man took up the hood, he became more than himself. He became justice. Cold and impersonal for the townspeople, the hood added to the mystery. Children whispered about what lay beneath it. Some said the executioner's eyes were hollow, his face pale as a corpse. Others believed he had no face at all, only darkness, where his features should be. In reality, he was often an ordinary man with ordinary fears. The hood allowed him to hide not just his identity, but his humanity. In the 1600s, justice was often swift and public. A thief might lose a hand, a murderer might lose his head. The punishment was not only for the condemned, but also for the crowd that gathered. It was meant to warn and instruct. This is what happens when you break the law. The executioner's role was to carry out this justice cleanly. A single well-aimed strike of the axe was a mark of professionalism. A clumsy blow, however, could bring shame and anger. Stories spread of executions gone wrong where the condemned suffered multiple strikes before death. Such failures haunted even the most hardened of executioners. When not at work, the executioner lived a quieter life than most would expect. He tended his small garden, he mended his tools, he sat by the hearth in the evenings, sharpening his blade with slow, steady strokes. But there was no escaping his reputation. Children avoided his path in the market. Neighbors spoke his name only in whispers. Some believed that sharing food or drink with an executioner brought bad luck. Yet he was necessary. The same people who avoided him would gather eagerly on execution day, watching closely as he walked to the scaffold. He carried the weight of their expectations along with the tools of his trade. At night, when the town slept, the executioner lay awake. He thought of the faces of those he had executed. Some had gone calmly whispering prayers, others had wept and screamed. Did their eyes follow him into his dreams? Perhaps. He did not speak of it to anyone. His thoughts were his own, locked behind the same silence that wrapped around his home like a cloak. The hood, the axe, the rope, they were part of his public life. In private, he was just a man trying to find peace. In a world that asked him to take life in the name of justice, the executioner lived between worlds, life and death, justice and fear, acceptance and rejection. He was both servant of the law and outcast of society. To understand him is not to glorify his role, but to see the human beneath the hood. He was not a monster, nor was he a hero. He was a man shaped by the strange needs of his time, carrying out a duty that few others could bear. As you rest now, imagine the executioner's house in a quiet corner of the village. The streets are empty. The air is still. Inside, he sits by the fire, sharpening his blade with slow, even strokes. His hands move steadily, his eyes distant. Outside, the first stars appear in the night sky. The crowd is gone. The scaffold is silent. For now, there is only quiet. Your breathing slows. The weight of the day begins to lift. Sleep gathers softly around you, like a warm blanket carrying you into gentle dreams. The sun had not yet risen over the hills, but the faint glow of morning already touched the edge of the sky. Inside a small wooden house on the outskirts of the village, the executioner stirred in his bed. His room was simple, bare wooden walls, a rough-hewn table, and a bed of straw covered in a wool blanket. Beside him sat a small chest. Inside it were the tools of his trade, a black hood, a carefully sharpened axe, and a coiled length of rope. Today was an execution day. He rose slowly as he always did, letting his bare feet touch the cool earth floor. There was no rush. He had learned over the years that his work demanded calm. A restless mind led to a restless hand, and that was a danger he could not afford. The executioner dressed in silence, pulling on his coarse linen shirt and heavy leather boots. As he tightened the laces, he listened to the stillness of the house. Outside, the world was waking. The distant sound of roosters, the faint creak of cart wheels, the soft murmur of villagers beginning their day. On the table sat a loaf of bread and a small jug of ale, left for him by the woman who tended his household. She never stayed overnight. Few wished to be near an executioner when darkness fell. He ate a small piece of bread, chewing slowly. He drank only a mouthful of ale. Too much food or drink made his hand unsteady, and today his hand needed to be true. Before leaving, he opened the small chest and ran his fingers over the blade of his axe. It was sharp, polished to a mirror's sheen. He had spent hours sharpening it the night before, working by candlelight as the rest of the village slept. Satisfied, he placed the hood in a cloth bag and slung it over his shoulder. He took the axe in his hand, wrapping the blade in cloth to keep it clean. The executioner stepped outside into the pale light of dawn. The air was cool and smelled faintly of earth and smoke from the night's fires. As he walked toward the town square, he felt the familiar hush fall over those he passed. Villagers glanced at him from doorways and windows, but quickly turned away. Some muttered blessings under their breath. Others made the sign of the cross. Children, curious and afraid, peered out from behind their mothers' skirts. One little boy whispered, "That's him, the man with the axe." The executioner heard but did not react. He was used to it. The executioner found comfort in small things. The warm smell of bread baking in the hearth, the feel of sunlight on his face in the morning, the rare sound of laughter drifting from the village square. These small moments reminded him he was still human, not just a hooded figure feared by all. As you rest now, imagine the executioner sitting in his small house, the glow of firelight on his face. Outside the world is still. Inside he breathes slowly, trying to release the weight of his thoughts. Your eyelids grow heavy, the burdens of the day drift away. Sleep gathers around you like a gentle fog, soft and quiet. The day of an execution began long before the first villagers gathered in the square, long before the murmurs of the crowd or the priest's soft prayers. The executioner was awake, moving through a quiet series of steps. These rituals were as much for himself as for the condemned. They steadied his mind, prepared his tools, and gave structure to a task heavy with fear and finality. Every movement, polishing the blade, adjusting the noose, testing the creaking scaffold, was slow and deliberate. In these moments of preparation, the executioner became more than a man. He became the hand of justice, ready to bring the law's sentence into the physical world. Let us move softly into this space where the air is thick with anticipation and watch as the rituals unfold. The sun had not yet broken the horizon when the executioner stirred. In the dim light of his home, he dressed in silence. His clothes were plain but clean. On a small table beside the hearth sat his tools. The axe polished until the edge gleamed, a coil of fresh hemp rope, and the black hood folded neatly. The house smelled faintly of oil and iron. He lit a single candle, its warm glow flickering across the rough walls. This was his time of solitude, the last calm before stepping into the eyes of the crowd. After breaking his fast with a crust of bread and a sip of ale, the executioner made his way to the town square. The air was still cool, the sky painted in pale shades of gray and blue. The scaffold loomed ahead, a wooden platform built for visibility. Its boards creaked softly under his boots. As he climbed, he walked the length of it slowly, testing each plank with careful pressure. A weak or loose board could lead to disaster. Next, he inspected the chopping block. Running his fingers over its surface, it bore the scars of past executions. Deep grooves where the axe had struck true, satisfied that it was sturdy. He moved on to the gallows beam, tugging at the ropes to ensure their strength. The executioner's hands were methodical, his movements unhurried. To the few who might glance out of their windows at this early hour, he appeared as calm and precise as a craftsman at work. Returning home, the executioner placed the axe across his knees. A whetstone sat in a bowl of water nearby. He lifted it and began to draw it along the blade in smooth, even strokes. The sound was soft, almost soothing, stone on steel, a gentle rasping that filled the quiet room. With each pass, he inspected the edge, watching how it caught the light, yet not so fragile that it would chip or break. As he worked, he allowed his mind to settle. He thought not of the crowd that would gather, nor of the condemned man's face. He thought only of the blade, of its curve and weight, of the way it would feel when lifted high. While the executioner prepared his tools, the condemned man was undergoing his own ritual in a small cell. He was visited by a priest who offered him confession and prayer. The condemned often wept or trembled. The priest spoke softly, his words like balm against the sharp edge of fear. Together they recited prayers, asking God for forgiveness, for strength, for peace in the final moments. The condemned was then offered a last meal. Some ate hungrily, clinging to the small comfort of food. Others pushed the plate away, their stomachs knotted with dread. Finally, the condemned's hands were bound. Guards led him from the cell, his footsteps echoing down the narrow corridor. The condemned's journey to the scaffold was a ritual in itself. In some towns, a bell tolled slowly as the procession moved through the streets, its deep notes warning villagers of what was to come. Flanking the condemned were guards in heavy boots, their faces grim. Villagers gathered along the route, some silent, others jeering or shouting prayers. Children clung to their mothers' skirts. Peeking out with wide eyes, the executioner waited on the scaffold, his hood already in place. To the crowd, he appeared faceless, a symbol rather than a man. Once the condemned reached the platform, there was a moment of stillness. The priest stepped forward, offering the man one last chance to speak. Some condemned used these final breaths to beg forgiveness, to proclaim innocence, or to warn others against following their path. Others remained silent, their eyes closed, lips moving in prayer. The executioner listened but did not speak. His role was not to judge, only to act. If the condemned was to be hanged, the executioner checked the noose carefully, ensuring the knot sat just so beneath the ear. The placement mattered. Done correctly, it would snap the neck swiftly. Done poorly, it would lead to a slow and agonizing death. If the axe was to be used, he guided the condemned to kneel, resting their chin on the block. His hand was steady, his voice low, and even as he gave quiet instructions, the final ritual was his own. He placed both hands on the axe, feeling its weight. He inhaled deeply, letting the air fill his lungs, and exhaled slowly, clearing his mind. The world seemed to fall away. The murmurs of the crowd, the cries of the condemned, the priest's prayers, all faded until there was only the axe, the block, and the space between them. Then, with a single, clean motion, he brought the blade down. When it was done, the executioner stepped back. Guards removed the body. The crowd began to disperse. But for the executioner, his work was not yet complete. He cleaned the axe carefully, wiping away the blood with a rag. The blade was oiled, the edge checked for nicks or dull spots. He coiled the rope neatly and stored it away. Each act was deliberate, a way to close the chapter of the day and prepare himself for the next. As you drift toward sleep now, imagine the quiet after an execution. The scaffold stands empty under a pale sky. The crowd has gone. The air is still. In a small house at the edge of town, the executioner sits by his fire, hands folded in his lap, his breathing slow and steady. You feel the weight of the day slipping from your own shoulders. Your eyes grow heavy. Sleep gathers around you like a warm cloak, soft and silent. On cold nights, villagers claimed they heard voices from the scaffold. The condemned, they said, returned at midnight to speak their last words. Some swore they saw faint figures, pale and weeping, climbing the wooden steps again and again to ward off these spirits. People left offerings at the base of the scaffold: a crust of bread, a cup of milk, a sprig of rosemary. The executioner saw these gifts when he came in the morning to inspect the platform. He never touched them. He knew they were not for him. People whispered that the executioner carried herbs and charms to protect himself from the souls of the dead. A sachet of sage tucked into his coat, a coin with a hole through the center, strung on a leather cord around his neck, a sprig of rowan tree hidden in his boot. Perhaps some executioners believed in these protections. Perhaps they did not, but carrying them cost little. And if they gave comfort, who could say they were not worth it? To most villagers, the executioner was both feared and needed. He was shunned in the marketplace, but called upon when justice demanded a life. He was whispered about in fear, but respected for his steady hand. He was treated as unclean, but relied upon to keep the peace. This strange mix of fear and dependence gave rise to endless stories. The executioner became larger than life, a figure of mystery, part man and part legend. What secrets did the executioner truly hold? Perhaps he had none. Perhaps he was simply a man doing a hard and thankless job. Or perhaps, in the quiet of his home, he whispered prayers to keep the souls of the condemned from visiting his dreams. Perhaps he tied knots in a length of cord and hung it over his bed, believing it would catch wandering spirits. We cannot know for certain. That is the way of legends. They grow in the spaces where truth is silent. As you lie in your bed now, imagine the executioner sitting alone by his hearth. The hood rests on a stool. The axe leans against the wall, its edge catching the faint light of the fire. Outside, the village is quiet. Inside, the man breathes slowly, eyes closed. The myths and superstitions swirl around him like a soft mist. But he feels only the warmth of the room and the weight of sleep. Your eyelids grow heavy. The world drifts away. The secrets of the executioner fade into darkness, carrying you gently toward dreams. There comes a time when every hand grows unsteady, when the strongest arms lose their strength, when even the sharpest blade begins to dull, and the man who once stood tall on the scaffold feels the weight of the years pressing down. For the executioner, the end of a career was not marked by celebration or gratitude. There were no feasts in his honor, no songs sung of his service. Instead, it was a quiet fading away, as unremarkable as the falling of a single leaf in autumn. Tonight, let us walk softly beside him as he nears the end of his long and lonely path. It often began in small, subtle ways. The executioner's hands, once steady as stone, trembled ever so slightly when he lifted the axe. The blade that had sung so cleanly through the air now felt heavier in his grasp when sharpening the edge. He noticed tiny nicks and imperfections he could not seem to smooth away. The whetstone scraped differently, or perhaps it was his ears that no longer heard its song in the same way. He worked harder to hide these changes, practicing each swing in solitude, whispering prayers that his strength would last a little longer. In the quiet of his home, he sometimes thought back over the years. The young thief who had wept like a child, the soldier who had stood tall, staring straight ahead even as the noose tightened. The woman accused of witchcraft, her voice rising in one last desperate curse. So many faces, so many voices, each one etched into his memory like carvings on wood, and now with age creeping into his bones. Those memories felt heavier than ever. In his youth, the executioner believed he would always be strong. He swung the blade with ease, climbed the scaffold steps without effort, and endured the stares of the crowd without flinching. But time is patient and unrelenting. It wore away at his body, his mind, even his spirit. The villagers seemed younger. Now, the priests who once prayed beside him had grown old or passed on, replaced by soft-voiced novices with downcast eyes. Even the scaffold itself showed signs of wear. The wood creaked more loudly underfoot. The gallows beam bore the marks of countless ropes. In some towns, the executioner was required to train a replacement. This, too, was done quietly, with little ceremony. He watched as the young man, often a criminal, offered pardon in exchange for service, struggled with the weight of the axe. He taught him how to tie a proper noose, how to sharpen the blade until it gleamed, how to move with calm purpose, even as the crowd murmured and jeered. "Steady hands," he said softly, "steady hands and a steady heart." It was strange to see another man don the hood, strange to hear the sound of the axe in someone else's grip. One day, the executioner performed his final duty. Perhaps it was a clean strike, a last act of precision before his strength failed entirely. Or perhaps it was a faltering blow, a grim reminder that the time had come to step away. When it was over, he handed the axe to his successor. The hood was folded carefully, placed in the younger man's hands. No words were spoken. None were needed. The crowd dispersed, as always, unaware that they had witnessed the end of an era. The executioner did not leave the village. He had nowhere else to go, but his days changed. He no longer climbed the scaffold. He no longer woke before dawn to sharpen the blade. He no longer felt the weight of the hood on his shoulders. Instead, he tended a small garden behind his home. He mended his own clothes and carved wooden figures to pass the time, though the villagers still avoided him. Their fear seemed to soften slightly with the passing years. Children whispered about him less. Merchants, though wary, began to accept his coins again, even in retirement. The priest's soft prayers, the heavy tolling of the bell. Sometimes he awoke in the small hours, heart pounding, unsure if he had truly laid down the axe, or if he was still trapped in that endless cycle of life and death. He whispered prayers in the darkness, hoping they would carry away the weight he still felt. when the end came for the executioner. It was quiet. There was no scaffold, no crowd, no hood, only a man lying in a narrow bed, the faint light of the hearth flickering against the walls. Perhaps he felt relief. Perhaps he feared judgment. Or perhaps he was too tired to feel anything at all. In the morning, a neighbor found his body. Word spread slowly through the village. Some crossed themselves and whispered prayers. Others shook their heads and said nothing. The executioner's legacy was not carved in stone or recorded in books. It lived in the memories of those who had watched him work, in the stories whispered by children, in the quiet fear that lingered in the hearts of the villagers. To some, he was a necessary evil. To others, a figure of sorrow. But to himself, he was only a man who had done the work no one else would do. As you rest now, imagine the executioner's empty house. The fire has burned low. The axe and hood are gone, passed to another hand. Outside, the village is silent under a sky full of stars. You feel the heaviness of the years drifting away. Your breath slows. Sleep gathers around you gently, carrying you into dreams as soft and deep as the night itself. There, love was not loud or showy. It was steady and enduring, like the slow growth of roots beneath the earth. The house of silences, you rest now. Imagine their small house at the village's edge. The garden is still, the hearth glows faintly, and the family sleeps peacefully within. The world beyond their walls might fear and shun them. But here, in this quiet space, there is warmth, there is tenderness, there is a love that endures, even under the shadow of the scaffold. Your own breath slows. Ropes and rituals. The work of the executioner was as much about preparation as it was about the act itself. Long before the crowd gathered and the condemned was brought forth, the axe, the rope, and the block were not merely instruments of death. They were carefully maintained, treated with respect, and sometimes even fear. Tonight, let us step into that world of iron, wood, and silence. Let us examine the tools of the trade and the quiet ceremonies that surrounded them. A good executioner kept his axe as sharp as a surgeon's knife, the head forged of iron or steel. The blade was curved to deliver a clean blow. Some blades bore marks from years of used tiny nicks along the edge, faint stains that no amount of polishing could remove the shaft. A sturdy wooden handle, long enough to provide leverage, but balanced to ensure control. The wood was often treated with oil to prevent cracking. Each morning before an execution, the blade was inspected carefully. The executioner ran his thumb lightly along the edge, not enough to cut, but enough to feel its sharpness. Then he set to work with whetstone and cloth, coaxing the steel to a keen gleam. It was said that the axe reflected the soul of its master. A clean blade was a sign of a careful, merciful man. A dull or nicked edge spoke of negligence, or worse, a lack of compassion. The rope, the gallows embrace. If the axe was a tool of precision, the rope was a tool of inevitability. Hemp rope was most commonly used, strong, fibrous, and able to bear the weight of a man. Preparation. The rope was measured carefully, the length adjusted for the height and weight of the condemned. Too short, and the neck would not break. Too long, and the body might be torn in the fall. The knot. The noose was tied with practiced hands. A hangman's knot, with its 13 coils. Others sold sections of it to curious villagers. who carried the grim tokens as charms or warnings. The block and the scaffold, the wooden block, was simple in appearance, yet crucial in practice. Design: a sturdy plank, slightly concave to cradle the neck. It was low to the ground, allowing the condemned to kneel or lie flat. Care: the surface was sanded smooth to avoid splinters. Between executions, the block was scrubbed with water and sand, though faint stains often lingered. The scaffold itself was an extension of the executioner's tools. Built of oak or pine, its boards creaked underfoot. Each knot in the wood became familiar to the executioner over time, an intimate stage on which his solemn duty was performed. The hood for the condemned and the executioner. The hood was a simple square of black cloth, yet it served two purposes. For the condemned, pulled over the head, it spared the victim the sight of the crowd, and spared the crowd the sight of the victim's final expressions. For the executioner, when worn by him, it hid his identity, shielding him from recognition and from the eyes of grieving families. Some executioners refused the hood, believing a man should meet his end face to face. Others wore it religiously, feeling its weight as both protection and burden. The rituals of the trade. The executioner's work was not without ritual. Sharpening the blade. This was a meditation as much as a chore. The rhythmic scrape of whetstone on steel. Chalk or charcoal marks indicated where the condemned should kneel or where the executioner's feet should stand for balance. Before each execution, some men crossed themselves or murmured blessings over their tools. Others worked in silence, trusting only in their skill. Superstitions around the tools carried their own myths. A whetstone that had sharpened an executioner's axe was said to grant courage if carried in a pocket. Touching the noose after a hanging was believed to bring good fortune or terrible luck. Depending on the village's lore, some believed the block absorbed the souls of the condemned, and to rest one's hand on it invited restless dreams. Even the executioner sometimes felt these stories creeping into his thoughts, no matter how rational he tried to remain. The quiet of preparation is, you lie still now. Imagine the executioner in his home on the eve of an execution. The fire burns low. The whetstone slides slowly across the blade. The rope is coiled neatly, the knot tested with careful tugs. There is no sound but the scrape of stone, the creak of wood, the slow, steady breathing of a man preparing for the work no one else will do. In the quiet, your own breathing softens. The rhythm of sharpening and coiling lulls you toward sleep, gentle as a lullaby in the dark. Legends of famous executioners. Though the executioner's hood was meant to hide a man's face, some names slipped past the veil of history and lingered in whispers and written records. These were men who stood apart not because they sought fame, but because their skill, their mercy, or their cruelty etched them into memory. To the villagers, they were more than men. They were figures of fear and fascination. Myths grew around them like ivy, blending fact and rumor, until even the executioner himself might not recognize his own story. Tonight, let us step quietly into their lives. Let us meet these shadowed figures and listen to the tales that were told of them. Jack Ketch, the king's headsman in 17th century England. No name was more infamous than Jack Ketch. The man Ketch served as the royal executioner under King Charles II. He was tasked with beheading nobles, rebels, and traitors. During a turbulent time in English history, the axe, though he was skilled with the rope, Ketch's reputation suffered after botched beheadings. His axe strikes were said to be unsteady, requiring multiple blows. The people whispered that Ketch was cursed. He feels the souls cling to his hands, they said. That is why his blade falters. Others believed he prolonged the suffering on purpose, a cruel man enjoying his power. After his death, any executioner who performed poorly was called a Jack Ketch, as if the man's spirit had possessed them. Franz Schmidt, the gentleman executioner, in stark contrast to Ketch, was Franz Schmidt of 16th century Nuremberg. The man Schmidt kept meticulous records of his work, writing down the name, crime, and final words of every condemned person. Over his career, he executed 394 people. The reputation, despite his grim profession, Schmidt was known for his fairness and compassion. When not on the scaffold, he worked as a healer, tending to the sick and injured. The people of Nuremberg respected him. Though he lived apart, he was called upon for advice, and his skill as a surgeon made him a valued member of the community. Even centuries later, his careful handwriting in dusty ledgers feels like a whisper from a man who bore the weight of his duty with dignity. Jean-Baptiste Sanson, the executioner of the Revolution during the French Revolution, Charles Henry Sanson, became a household name. The guillotine. Sanson oversaw thousands of executions, including the beheadings of King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. The guillotine, designed for swiftness and equality in death, became his constant companion. The man, despite his role in the bloodiest years of French history, Sanson reportedly dreaded his work. He viewed it as a duty, not a calling, chanted his name as if he were a hero or villain. But Sanson himself longed for quiet. At night, he wrote letters and diaries, pouring out his sorrow over the endless river of blood. In his words, there were countless others whose names were never recorded. The village headsman who carried out 3 or 4 hangings in his lifetime. The wandering swordsman hired for a single noble beheading. The reluctant farmer pressed into service when no one else would step forward. Their faces are lost to time, but in old records and parish registers, traces of them remain. On this day, the sentence was carried out by the hand of the headsman. No name, only a shadow. The burden of notoriety fame was not always a gift. For some executioners, it was a curse. Children spat in the street as they passed. Artists drew their likenesses in cruel caricature, exaggerating their features to monstrous proportions. Priests hesitated to offer absolution, unsure if a man could wash away so much blood. Even in death, their graves were often unmarked, their bones left to rest without prayers. Legends and lies stories of executioners were embroidered. Over time, growing more fantastical with each retelling. One tale spoke of a headsman whose blade drank blood and sharpened itself at night. Another told of a hangman who was followed by the ghosts of all he had killed, their faces appearing in every puddle and mirror he looked into. In some villages, people swore the executioner could not die a natural death, that he was doomed to wander the earth until another man willingly took up the hood. Perhaps these stories were born from fear, or perhaps they held a seed of truth, a final reflection as you lie still now. Think of these mensum cruel, some kind, all bound by duty. Their lives were heavy, their names both whispered in dread and etched into history. Yet in the end, they were only human. Men who sharpened their blades by candlelight, who carried their burdens alone, who longed for peace in a world that never gave it to them. The night grows quiet. Their voices fade into the darkness, and you, too, drift gently toward sleep, carried on the soft murmur of old, forgotten stories. The moral weight of justice and executioner did not only carry an axe or a rope. He carried something heavier, something that could not be set down even when his day's work was done. It was the weight of justice, the knowledge that his hands delivered the punishment of the law, and yet also ended lives in the villages and cities of old Europe. People believed justice was divine, handed down from kings and priests, but it was the executioner who became its living instrument. Each swing of the blade, each tightening of the noose, was not just an act of muscle and skill. It was a moral burden, one that pressed down harder with every life taken. Tonight, let us sit with that burden. Let us feel the quiet heaviness of a man who did what others would not, and yet wondered, always, if it was truly right. The law and the axe, the executioner's work, was not born of cruelty. It was born of law. The king decreed punishment. The magistrates wrote the orders. The priests blessed the condemned and prayed for their souls. But in the end, it was the executioner's arm that carried out the sentence. He was not a judge. He was not allowed to question the verdict. Yet sometimes, as he stood upon the scaffold, he wondered, was this man truly guilty, or was he a pawn in a game I cannot see? These thoughts were dangerous. To doubt the justice of the law was to risk madness, and so most executioners buried these questions deep inside, hidden even from themselves. Mercy in the hands of the law, though his role was feared. An executioner could be a man of mercy. A skilled headsman prided himself on delivering a clean strike, sparing the condemned unnecessary pain. A careful hangman measured his ropes to ensure the neck broke swiftly. If it must be done, they whispered, then let it be done well. But mercy did not erase the moral weight. A clean strike was still a strike. A quick death was still death. At night, some executioners lit candles for the souls of the dead, asking forgiveness for the part they had played, the stain that would not wash away no matter how skillfully he worked, no matter how faithfully he served the law. The executioner was stained in the eyes of his neighbors. They avoided his touch, fearing it carried death. They spoke his name in hushed tones, as if saying it too loudly would summon misfortune. Even priests sometimes hesitated before offering him communion, wondering if such a man could ever be clean in the sight of God. This rejection weighed heavily on the executioner's soul. He was doing the work society demanded, yet he bore all the shame for it. The condemned were thieves, murderers, traitors. They deserved their punishment. But as the years passed, doubts crept in like shadows at the edges of his vision. He remembered the boy of 17, trembling as the hood was drawn over his head. He recalled the woman who swore her innocence with her last breath. He could not forget the nobleman who bribed his way to freedom, while poor men swung from the gallows for lesser crimes. Was this truly justice, or was it only power wearing the mask of law? These thoughts returned to him at night, in the silence of his home. They settled on his chest like stones, heavy and unmovable. The executioner's reflection when he looked into a mirror. What did he see? A man who kept order in a dangerous world, or a man who had become the very thing he feared, a bringer of suffering? There were days when he could not tell. Some executioners turned to drink to silence these questions. Others prayed more fervently, hoping God would lift the weight from their hearts. A few left their work behind entirely, vanishing into distant lands in search of peace. Justice as a shifting thing. The executioner knew that justice was not fixed. What was punishable today might be pardoned tomorrow. In 1 year, a man might lose his hand for theft. The next, he might be merely fined. A woman once burned as a witch might, in another time, be called a healer and revered. He wondered, if the law can change, what does that mean for all the lives I have taken? Were they just, or were they simply unlucky? Not his wife, not his children, not the priests. He carried the weight alone. Each time he climbed the scaffold, it grew heavier. Each time he wiped the blade clean, it pressed harder on his soul. And yet he continued, because someone had to. This, too, was part of the moral weight, the knowledge that if he refused, another man, perhaps less skilled, perhaps less merciful, would take his place. When the executioner's career ended, the weight did not leave him. It followed him into retirement, into old age, into the small hours of sleepless nights. Sometimes he dreamed of the scaffold. He saw the faces of the condemned, heard the murmurs of the crowd, felt the axe handle in his hands. In his dream, he stood, frozen, unable to lift the blade. And then he awoke, breathless, staring at the ceiling in the dim glow of the hearth. The heavy silences. You lie in your bed now. Imagine the executioner in his own small chamber. The fire is low, the air thick with silence. He stares at his hands, rough and scarred, wondering if they will ever feel clean. But there is no one to answer him, only the faint crackle of the fire and the soft sigh of wind against the walls. Your breath slows, your eyes grow heavy. The weight of justice, though vast, fades into the night, carrying you gently into dreams as quiet as falling snow. The executioner's legacy in history, the executioner's work, was never meant to leave a legacy. His hood was designed to conceal his face. His name was whispered, if spoken at all. And yet, across the centuries, the shadow of his role lingers. Though he stood apart in life, history has not forgotten him. His figure appears in old records, paintings, and whispered tales, often exaggerated into myth, but still tethered to truth. Tonight, let us walk slowly through the echoes of his memory. Let us see how the world remembers these men who held the blade and tied the noose, how their legacy survives in ways quiet and unexpected. Graves without names, many executioners were buried in unmarked graves. Villagers feared that naming such a man in stone might bring ill fortune. Some churches refused to allow him burial in consecrated ground, believing the work had stained his soul. A few were laid to rest outside town walls, their bodies returning to the earth quietly, without prayers or tolling bells. Yet others, like Franz Schmidt of Nuremberg, managed to redeem their names. His grave was marked respectfully, and today visitors leave small offerings, flowers, even handwritten notes, thanking him for his kindness in life. Even in death, the executioner's legacy was divided. Some were cursed, some were blessed. Most were simply forgotten. The written record in court ledgers. Executioners appear only briefly. The sentence was carried out. The headsman performed his duty. Rarely are they named. Their work was functional, not celebrated. But, in some rare cases, executioners kept their own records. Franz Schmidt's meticulous journal lists every person he executed, every punishment he performed, and even his thoughts about justice and mercy. These documents offer us a glimpse into a world where justice was harsh, and those who enforced it lived in a strange space between duty and exile, art and symbolism, paintings and woodcuts from centuries past. The executioner often appears as a faceless figure, a man in a black hood, axe raised high, a rope dangling from a wooden beam, the hangman standing beside it like a silent sentinel. Over time, this facelessness became a symbol in literature. The executioner became the embodiment of law and punishment. In folklore, he turned into a ghostly figure, cursed to wander with his bloodied tools. In modern media, he is often portrayed as a villain, rarely as the complex, conflicted man he truly was. The executioner in folklore stories of executioners grew in the telling. In one village, they said the headsman's axe could never be touched by another hand, lest it bite the flesh of its new master in another. People whispered that the hangman's noose tightened of its own accord at night, searching for a neck to claim. Some tales claimed the executioner's ghost still haunted scaffolds and gallows, endlessly repeating his grim duty. These stories reveal as much about the fears of the living as they do about the men themselves. The question of justices, centuries passed and laws softened. The role of executioner faded. Public hangings were replaced by private ones. The scaffold was dismantled. The guillotine was stored away, then retired entirely. Today, we look back and ask questions that once seemed dangerous. Was justice truly served? Did the executioner uphold peace, or did he become part of the cycle of violence? Could society have found a better way? The answers are complex, like the men themselves. Modern reflections, though the professional executioner no longer exists in most of the world. His shadow lingers. Historians study his tools and methods. Writers and filmmakers imagine his thoughts and fears. Moral philosophers debate the ethics of his work, even centuries after his hood was laid aside. In some places, people honor executioners who tried to act with mercy. In others, their names are still spoken with dread. The legacy is not one thing. It is many things, intertwined like the coils of a rope. The end of the line. Execution now, the very last executioner in a long lineage. He sharpens his blade one final time, wipes it clean, and sets it down. The hood is folded carefully and placed in a chest that will never be opened again. The scaffold is dismantled, the wood repurposed for homes and barns. The rope is burned. The gallows beam is taken down, and the earth beneath it heals. Grass growing where once there was only dust and fear. For the first time in centuries, there is no man in the village who carries the title of executioner. The soft fade of memory as you lie still now. Think of the executioner's legacy not in terms of fear or violence, but as a reminder of the human heart's complexity. He was not a monster. He was a man who bore a terrible duty, who longed for peace, who wanted what we all want in the end, to be remembered kindly, if at all. the night deepens, the stories fade, the axe is silent, and your breathing slows as you drift into dreams, as soft and quiet as a world where the executioner's shadow no longer falls.